sirens tore through the stillness of midnight America. In Atlanta, Chicago, and Portland, doors splintered, flashbangs lit up living rooms, and agents in black body armor shouted names that had lived only in encrypted chat rooms. The sound of boots echoed off walls, plastered with slogans of rebellion. No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA. But tonight, those words weren't chanted in the streets, they were evidence. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security had launched the largest domestic counter-terror sweep in nearly a decade. Their target, the operational core of Antifa, now accused of running a nationwide criminal network. It began just after 12:03 a.m. in Georgia. Federal task forces moved simultaneously across 3 states, storming safehouses long suspected of housing Antifa organizers. The dawn that followed revealed a country on edge. Boxes of improvised explosives, tactical vests, and hard drives full of encrypted chats lay scattered across the scene. For years, politicians debated whether Antifa was myth or movement, but the grand jury's verdict was clear. Under the same RICO laws once used to dismantle the Mafia, Antifa's inner circle now faced charges of racketeering, arson, and domestic terrorism. This was more than an arrest, it was a declaration. America's war on extremism had come home. Reuters confirmed that 61 individuals were indicted in Georgia alone, while BBC and Al Jazeera reported parallel arrests in Illinois and Oregon. Investigators described a web of small collectives operating like paramilitary cells, each armed, funded, and communicating through encrypted servers. DHS officials called it the most sophisticated domestic extremist ecosystem in the country. The Guardian noted how these raids represented a shift in counter-terror doctrine from reacting to riots to preempting networks before they ignite. But why now? Analysts say the escalation came after the ambush near the Prairieland Detention Center in Texas, where attackers lured officers into the open with fireworks before opening fire. The tactic mirrored assaults seen in Atlanta's Defend the Forest riots and in small skirmishes across Portland last year. Defense News drew parallels between Antifa's coordination methods and hybrid warfare techniques used abroad, blurring lines between protest and insurgency. Jane's Defense Weekly even compared their compartmentalized cells to urban guerrilla tactics studied in Eastern Europe. As Washington shifted from observation to eradication, the world watched closely. Russia's intelligence outlets accused the United States of weaponizing internal dissent, while Beijing called it proof that American democracy eats itself. Meanwhile, allies in Europe privately voiced relief, fearing similar radical cells spreading in Berlin and Paris. The same ideological fever that burned in US streets had echoes in youth movements across NATO capitals, from eco-sabotage networks to militant anarchist collectives inspired by Antifa's defiance. The arrest sent shockwaves beyond politics. Families of suspects woke to find their children labeled as terrorists. Protest groups condemned the crackdown as an assault on free speech, while supporters of law enforcement hailed it as justice long overdue. On social media, the divide widened. Defenders of anti-fascism claimed moral high ground. Critics warned that moral purity had turned into militancy. In the midst of this national fracture, one question hung heavy. How far can a democracy go to defend itself before it becomes the very thing it fears? The images from Georgia were shocking: flames lighting the skyline above Atlanta's South River forest, masked figures hurling Molotovs, and police advancing through a storm of fireworks and shattered glass. What began as environmental activism had transformed into armed resistance. The group behind it, calling itself Defend the Atlanta Forest, had claimed to be fighting against what they labeled state oppression, but prosecutors revealed something different. The hub was a recruiting ground, a regional arm of Antifa's expanding network. Reuters and BBC confirmed that among those arrested, only 2 were actually from Georgia. The rest had traveled from out of state, some from as far as Michigan and New York. Investigators now believe these hubs weren't isolated. They were nodes in a decentralized command system. The raids exposed a structure that functioned like a paramilitary grid, complete with logistics officers, propaganda liaisons, and encrypted chain of command channels. In one tent, agents found printed manuals labeled Organizing for Attack, Insurrection, Anarchy. Analysts at Defense News described the setup as urban warfare on a micro scale. Homemade explosives filled with camping fuel, anti-police graffiti marking supply routes, and body armor stashed beside first aid kits. The pattern was chillingly familiar. Similar methods had surfaced during the 2020 Portland riots, later repeated in Chicago's autonomous zones. For years, these events were dismissed as local chaos. Now, under forensic investigation, they appeared coordinated. The turning point came when FBI cyber units traced encrypted payments moving between accounts linked to Antifa-aligned charities. These small transactions, $10, $20, $50 at a time, funded travel bail and field equipment, a pattern identical to financing tactics used by extremist organizations abroad. The Guardian cited officials comparing it to early-stage insurgencies in Iraq, where cells sustained themselves through microfinancing to avoid detection. The evolution from protest to paramilitary wasn't spontaneous, it was strategic. Al Jazeera's investigative desk reported that recruitment often began online on Discord and Signal, disguised as social justice communities. The first step, ideological bonding through anti-establishment rhetoric. The second, operational training. Members learned how to block police vehicles, erase metadata, and coordinate flash attacks under the guise of direct action. By the time they hit the streets, many saw themselves not as vandals, but as revolutionaries. Yet this radical transformation carried global resonance. DW highlighted parallels between Antifa's doctrine and European anarchist factions like the ZAD in France, or Germany's autonomous movements that merged environmentalism with militant resistance. Analysts warned that the transatlantic exchange of tactics could turn local disobedience into a global insurgent culture. Even Moscow's propaganda outlets seized on the chaos, portraying it as proof that Western liberalism breeds its own extremists. Inside Washington, the implications were severe. President Trump ordered DHS and FBI to form a joint intelligence unit to map the Antifa network's communications, an initiative that Defense News likened to post-9/11 counter-terror models. Officials insisted the move wasn't ideological but strategic to preempt attacks before they reached the streets. Still, civil liberty advocates warned of overreach, fearing that protest itself might now fall under surveillance. On the ground, the aftermath was raw. Burned-out vehicles, bullet-riddled police shields, and hand-painted signs reading "Fire to the System." For investigators, it was evidence. For activists, it was martyrdom. In a nation still divided by fear and freedom, one question remained when rebellion turns organized. Does it stop being protest, or does it become war? It began with a single spreadsheet, thousands of microtransactions flowing into a nonprofit listed to a P.O. box in Atlanta. Each donation appeared harmless community aid, environmental defense bail support. But when Treasury analysts compared those numbers with receipts found at raid sites, the truth emerged. The money didn't buy food or blankets. It bought camping fuel, respirators, gas masks, and gloves, the very supplies used in assaults on law enforcement. Reuters reported that more than $310,000 had moved through this single conduit in just 6 months. Following the trail, agents discovered similar patterns in Oregon, Michigan, and New York. Each hub mirrored the next small charities that publicly promoted social justice while privately funding tactical operations. The Guardian called it a decentralized insurgency masquerading as activism. To unravel the system, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division joined forces with DHS cyber forensics teams. The breakthrough came from a frozen cryptocurrency wallet in Portland that funneled donations through overseas exchanges before converting them back to cash. DW noted that the process resembled micro-laundering, a digital tactic once favored by terror groups in the Middle East. The Justice Department began seizing crypto assets and subpoenaing payment platforms like Cash App and PayPal, revealing how the so-called leaderless resistance maintained a shadow economy. Defense News emphasized that Antifa's structure operated more like a logistics syndicate than a protest movement. Each region had its finance, collective media liaison, and gear quartermaster. At the top were moderators coordinating from encrypted servers rotating every few weeks to obscure leadership. Jane's Defense Weekly compared it to clandestine cells used in Cold War sabotage networks, horizontal by design, yet synchronized by ideology. But what made this network so resilient wasn't only its funding, it was its moral camouflage. BBC reports showed how legitimate donors, often unaware of the true recipients, sent small sums believing they were helping arrested protesters or supporting climate campaigns. In reality, those dollars financed cross-state travel and safehouse rentals. Al Jazeera revealed leaked chats instructing members to split large sums into dozens of micro-grants to avoid detection by Treasury monitors. When agents raided a townhouse outside Seattle, they found a disturbing clue, a binder labeled Security Culture 101. Inside were step-by-step procedures for secure communications, encryption keys, and travel budgets. The same manual appeared in Portland and New York raids, suggesting a standardized operational playbook. Investigators dubbed it the Corporate Manual of Chaos. As officials pieced the puzzle together, global parallels emerged. Intelligence analysts noted how Antifa's fundraising mirrored methods used by Iran-backed militias and more recently pro-Russian cyber activist groups, small digital donations, ideological propaganda, and coordinated social media messaging. Even Beijing's disinformation unit studied the unrest, portraying it as proof that Western democracy funds its own destabilization. The Biden years critics claimed ignored the creeping infrastructure of extremism. Under President Trump's renewed domestic security doctrine, that leniency vanished. Task forces were now authorized to freeze assets, preemptively treating these networks like transnational crime syndicates. Still behind every seizure, there were human stories, teachers, students, and nurses who donated $20 believing it went to humanitarian aid, only to learn their money-funded firebombs. That revelation shattered public trust. Across the nation, a new debate ignited if digital anonymity can turn compassion into complicity. How safe is the idea of cause-based giving? And as Washington's crackdown deepened, one haunting question echoed from Silicon Valley to Brussels. In an age where money moves faster than morality, who really controls the revolution? It starts with an idea, one that sounds noble at first. Fight fascism, save the planet, defend the oppressed. For many young recruits, those words felt righteous. But somewhere along the line, the message shifted. What began as moral defiance became an obsession with destruction. By the time the masks came on, the line between justice and vengeance was gone. Former members described the indoctrination as subtle and intoxicating. At first, it's community solidarity, purpose belonging. Then the group's language changes. According to The Guardian, discussions about reform evolve into calls for total resistance. DW reported that once a recruit questions the direction they are ostracized, cut off from friends, and branded a traitor. Silence is violence, one chant goes. Action is redemption. What's left is a culture that sanctifies confrontation and condemns compromise. Journalist Andy Ngo, who spent years infiltrating Antifa circles, calls it a faith built on rage. Members believe that America's institutions are inherently oppressive, that capitalism breeds fascism, and that law enforcement is the arm of tyranny. In that worldview, violence isn't a crime, it's divine retribution. Defense News compared the mindset to religious radicalization, a psychological loop where chaos becomes sacrament. BBC's investigation traced this radical transformation through the digital landscape. Online forums disguised as progressive study groups slowly shift toward operational planning. Guides titled Direct Action for the People teach how to disable surveillance cameras or block police vehicles with makeshift barriers. Once a recruit completes their first mission, they're celebrated in encrypted channels, a ritual of belonging that reinforces belief through adrenaline. The parallels with extremist indoctrination abroad are impossible to ignore. Al Jazeera cited counter-terror experts who compared Antifa's internal discipline to militant eco-factions in the Middle East and anarchist cells in Europe's far left. Jane's Defense Weekly highlighted that their leaderless resistance mirrors guerrilla models seen in Syria, where ideology, not hierarchy, sustains the movement. But what makes this ideology especially dangerous is its adaptability. Antifa frames every confrontation as self-defense, every act of destruction as liberation. They preach that institutions can't be reformed, only burned down and rebuilt. DW analysts warned that this mindset erodes the foundation of civil discourse, replacing it with perpetual revolution. President Trump's administration has called this belief an existential threat to the American system. Officials argue that Antifa's ideology weaponizes free speech itself, using democratic freedoms to justify anti-democratic violence. It's the paradox of liberty turned inward when freedom becomes the shield for anarchy. Yet beneath the slogans and fire, there are faces, students, veterans, disillusioned workers, people searching for meaning in a fractured nation. Some left the movement before crossing the point of no return. Others, seduced by its promise of purpose, now sit behind federal bars. Their letters obtained by Reuters reveal regret and confusion. "We thought we were fighting fascism," one wrote. "We became what we hated." As cities rebuild and courts prepare for the largest domestic terror trial in recent history, one truth burns: bright ideology can be more powerful than weapons. And when belief justifies violence, can any society claim to be free from its own extremes? By summer 2025, the mood in Washington had changed. The patience that once defined America's approach to domestic extremism was gone. The Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and the Justice Department launched a joint operation named Iron Resolve, a nationwide offensive designed to dismantle Antifa's infrastructure from the top down. Before dawn, federal teams executed synchronized raids in Portland, Dallas, Chicago, and Los Angeles. It was a meticulously timed strike that CNN and Reuters described as the most comprehensive domestic counterterrorism action since Oklahoma City. Inside converted warehouses and co-ops agents found encrypted drives, tactical maps of police facilities, and ledger books coded with aliases and Bitcoin keys. At a press conference later that day, President Donald Trump declared, "We will no longer allow violent extremists to hide behind political slogans. The law applies to everyone, and no ideology stands above it." The message resonated across the country. For some, it was the long-awaited restoration of order. For others, it was a warning shot across the bow of dissent. Behind the scenes, intelligence fusion centers originally built to track foreign terror plots were repurposed for domestic use. DW reported how analysts cross-referenced phone metadata, flight logs, and payment trails to build digital constellations of suspects. Al Jazeera called it a revolution in domestic intelligence, where data replaced informants and algorithms mapped the invisible hand of coordination. Jane's Defense Weekly compared the task force's methodology to counterinsurgency models used in Iraq: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze. Only this time the battlefield wasn't Fallujah but American cities. Defense News added that the integration of cyber forensics with field operations marked a new phase in law enforcement strategy pre-incident interdiction, the interception of extremist plots before they reached the streets. This shift drew both praise and alarm. Civil liberties groups questioned whether preemptive policing blurred the line between security and surveillance. The Guardian warned that indefinite data retention on domestic radicals risked criminalizing thought rather than action. Yet supporters of the crackdown countered that the Constitution was never meant to shield insurrection. Globally, allies watched with measured approval. Europe's intelligence agencies, struggling with their own anarchist resurgence, shared data and methods with US investigators. Israel's counterterror experts noted that Antifa's encrypted networks resembled the online recruitment patterns of Hamas-linked youth groups. Even Taiwan's Digital Security Directorate privately briefed the Pentagon on similar tactics used by pro-Beijing activists to disrupt democracy movements in Asia. Still, Trump's decision carried risk. Russia's state media denounced the operation as domestic militarization. China accused Washington of hypocrisy, claiming the US was waging ideological war against its own citizens. Yet inside NATO, senior officials saw something different, a superpower finally taking the digital insurgency seriously. The arrests rolled in. In Dallas, a logistics coordinator was taken into custody after 3 weeks of surveillance. In Portland, DHS agents stormed a safe house in under 6 minutes. Across the Midwest, crypto wallets froze mid-transaction. The federal crackdown was surgical, but the cultural backlash was swift. Universities held protests, civil rights attorneys filed injunctions, and activists flooded social media with the hashtag #WhoDefinesTerror. As one FBI source told BBC, "We're racing against time, not just to stop the violence, but to stop the narrative. Because every arrest feeds the myth of persecution that fuels the movement. Every conviction risks turning suspects into martyrs." And so the US stands at a crossroads between freedom of expression and freedom from fear. Can a democracy preserve both, or must it choose which one to save first? The courtroom was silent as the first of 61 defendants faced the judge in Georgia's largest RICO trial in decades. Shackled heads down, the accused extremists listened as prosecutors read the charges: racketeering, arson, conspiracy to commit terrorism. Each name was now part of a larger story, one that exposed the anatomy of a domestic insurgency in the heart of America. Reuters confirmed that federal prosecutors intend to connect every attack, every transfer, and every encrypted chat log into one narrative, an organized effort to undermine the US government. But beyond the courtroom walls, the country remains divided. To supporters of the crackdown, this is justice long overdue. To critics, it is overreach and example of the state branding dissent as terrorism. President Donald Trump framed the trials as a victory for American resilience. Yet even within his administration, voices of caution emerged. Senior officials at DHS warned that suppressing an ideology by force could risk its rebirth underground. History, after all, has shown that every crushed movement can become myth. The Guardian wrote that Washington now faces its greatest domestic balancing act since the McCarthy era: how to dismantle radical networks without eroding the freedoms that define the republic. DW analysts emphasize the geopolitical weight of the moment. The US already engaged intense standoffs with Russia, Iran, and China cannot afford domestic fractures that project weakness abroad. Beijing's state media has already portrayed the Antifa crackdown as proof of American instability. Moscow, meanwhile, is reportedly studying the Justice Department's tactics, calling it useful precedent for internal security operations. Yet America's allies see something else: a nation confronting its inner demons head-on. European officials told BBC that the lessons from this case will shape how NATO deals with the rise of militant eco-anarchists and digital insurgents spreading across Europe. Defense News highlighted that the joint FBI-DHS model could become a prototype for democratic nations seeking to protect civil order without descending into authoritarianism. But the deeper question goes beyond logistics and law. It touches the soul of democracy itself. Can freedom survive when its enemies exploit that very freedom to destroy it? In the aftermath of the raids, communities across Atlanta, Portland, and Chicago are left grappling with scars, burned out streets, broken trust, and a generation of youth radicalized by disillusionment. Families of those arrested face shame and confusion. Former members express remorse, admitting that what began as activism spiraled into violence. Yet amid the rubble of ideology and vengeance, new dialogues are emerging about digital accountability, the moral cost of rebellion, and how nations confront extremism born from within. The reckoning is far from over. Trials will stretch into 2026, evidence will surface, and history will decide whether this was the moment America reclaimed control or lost its moral compass. Because when the smoke clears and the verdicts fall, one truth will remain: every democracy must someday face the monster it created. And as the world watches, one final question lingers: has America's victory over extremism strengthened its freedom or quietly rewritten its definition? The takedown of Antifa marks a turning point in America's modern history, a collision between freedom and security, rebellion and order. What began as spontaneous protest has evolved into the largest domestic counter-terror operation in a generation. Under President Donald Trump, federal authorities reframed the movement as an organized criminal syndicate, applying the same tools once used against cartels and foreign terror cells. The crackdown revealed a movement driven by ideology, but sustained by money, technology, and disillusionment. Its defeat required new forms of intelligence warfare, digital mapping, financial interdiction, and preemptive policing. Yet victory carries its own risks. Civil liberties now stand in tension with national stability, and America's global rivals are eager to exploit every fracture. As the trials continue and the nation heals, the question remains: can democracy defend itself without destroying what makes it free? The answer may define not only the next election, but the future of the republic itself.